Hey everyone. So far in the series, we have containerized front-end apps like React and Vue, and even a Flask backend. Now, it's time for one of the most popular backend frameworks, Node.js with Express. In this video, we'll containerize an Express app using Podman. In this video, we'll create a simple Express server, write a Dockerfile, build an image using Podman, run the container, and expose our API. So let's get started in containerizing our Node Express app. First, let me open my Visual Studio Code. I'll open my directory, just enlarge it, and I'll close all this. In the root, I'll create a folder named Node Express Docker. So if you want to catch up with all this code, I have shared the GitHub link in my description. So please do check it out if you miss it out. Then I'll open my terminal. Let me zoom a bit. And I'll move into my directory, that is Node Express Docker. And here I'll be running npm init. Before you run this command, make sure that you have installed Node and npm in your local machine. Once you have installed it, then you can proceed with this command. So I'll click on npm init and I'll hit enter. So what is the package name? I'll put it as Node Express app, version, description. This is to demonstrate containerizing Node and Express app. Enter point index.js, test command, get repository, keywords. I'll keep it as Node. I'll name myself as author. So I'll click on enter, and if you come into this, here you'll find the initial version of my npm package. Now let's start installing some dependencies within our package.json. Now let me clear my terminal, just expand this, and here I'll write npm install, the npm command that is used to install some libraries, and I'll mention the name of the libraries. First, let me install Express, then I'll go for cross, it's CORS, then I'll install Helmet for security headers, then I'll go for Morgan, and then I'll hit enter. So here the packages are installed, and along with this I'll install another library called as NodeDaemon. So to install that, I'll type npm install and I'll pass a flag called as savedev. So I'll go it as nodemon. Hit enter, and here we can see the dev dependencies. So this package is only used in our development environment, and that is why it is being installed inside our dev dependencies. Now let me make some minor modifications inside my package.json. Here I can edit the license. I'll keep it as MIT, that is open source, and then instead of main.js I'll go for server.js. So this will be the endpoint file in our Express application. And then instead of test, what I'll do is I'll define dev. And here, what does this do? Whenever I run npm run dev, this command nodedaemon server.js is being executed. And whenever I run npm start, that is in the production, node server.js is executed, meaning nodedaemon is used in the dev environment, and in the production we'll be using direct node command. Now here we are done with our package.json. Now let us go and create some of our files. So I'll come to my Express Docker, and inside that I'll create a file called as server.js and I'll hit enter. So this is the file that will be executed whenever we run our commands. So I'll go to that file, and here first let me import few libraries. So this const, yes, and then we'll be using cross, and then I'll be using helmet, and then I'll be using Morgan. So these are the packages which we installed in our npm, and then I'll create the object of Express, and then I'll create a variable called as port, where we'll define what is the port our application will be executing. Here right now we won't be using env, we'll be using 3000. Now let me create some middlewares. I'll use const, and here I will, instead of const, I will use app, use cross, helmet, and Morgan combined. So this will create a middleware for me. Then I'll use app.use, and I'll be using express.json that will help me to give JSON responses. And then I'll use app.use express.url encoded and extended true. So this will help me to parse the URL encoded bodies. So now let us create some sample data. So let users equal to a list of records. So I'll keep it as John Doe, email, and then Jane Smith, Janet, exam.com. I'll just keep 2 users. Okay. Now let's start defining our API endpoints using Express. So for that, I'll be using the Express object, which we have defined here in the line number 6, and I'll be invoking a method called as get. So get method invokes a RESTful method called as get, which is used to get or retrieve data from the server or raising a request on the particular URL. So it accepts 2 parameters, the URLs and the function. So I will call it as just slash, and here I'll define a arrow function which accepts 2 parameter request and response. And then here I'll define. So I'll be using request.json, and inside the JSON object I'll be defining my body. So I'll be using message welcome to Node.js Docker API, and then I'll give the version as 1.0, and now let me define the endpoints. So I'll define the endpoints object, and inside that it's a list, and here to get all users, and then here I'll define a method called as post on path / users, the description creating a new user. So this will be my first method, and then let me with semicolon, and we'll finish up with this semicolon. So in JavaScript, the semicolon is optional, but we'll be following the same pattern by ending our braces with semicolons. Then I'll define another endpoint that is to get all the users at URL / users, which accepts two parameters, request and response. I'll be declaring an arrow function within it. So let me add a semicolon so that I won't miss out later. So here I'll send a request.json, and inside that I will pass an object where I'll mention as success true. Then I'll pass another field called as data, where I'll be passing the list users here. So I just end with semicolon. And also what I'll do is I'll pass the count of users. Then here I'll be using the built-in methods users.length. So this will return the length of my list. So this will be my one endpoint to get the users. Then I'll define another endpoint to create the users. Now, to create new users, we'll be using a method called as post method. So post is a RESTful API method which is used to send data from the client into the server. So it accepts two parameters, that is URLs and the controller function, that is request and response. We'll define it as a arrow function. So add the semicolon here, and inside this we'll define our logic to create a new user. I'll be defining two variables, that is name and email, which we will collect from request.body. So this method is called as destructuring, where we are collecting only the required data from our request body. And then I'll define the logic. Now, to create a user, we need to have name and email as a mandatory field. So we'll handle that. Suppose if I don't find name and email, then I will return response.status as 400, and inside that I'll embed a JSON object, and there I'll say that success as false and message name and email are required. So suppose if there is no value for name and email, then it will return a 404 error with the JSON body saying that name and email are required. Then I'll define an object that is const new user, and inside that I will assign the value. So for ID, it's users.len plus 1. So what does this do is this will first find the length of users what we are having, and then it will increment by 1. Then name, which we have collected from the request, then email. Then we'll be using the push operation of list to insert this data. User.push, and I'll pass what is the data I need to push. So it is new user. And then once the push operation is done, I'll return response.status as 201, meaning transaction successful. Then I'll embed a JSON object, and inside that I will say that success as true. Data, I'll pass it as new user, and then message a user created successfully. So we have defined two endpoints. First endpoint is to retrieve all the users, and second endpoint is to create a new user. Now Let me create a Docker file. Again, we have seen in the previous videos what is the purpose of this Docker file. So now inside this Docker file, first we need to mention the base image from node of version 20. I'll be using Alpine, a lightweight version of Linux operating system. I will set the work directory as /app, and then I'll use copy command to copy the package star.json into our container directory, and then I'll be using run command to install the dependencies, that is npm install, and here I'll be omitting the dev dependencies. So omit equal to dev, meaning we'll be ignoring the node daemon. Now nodemon is a library that is only useful in our dev environment, not in our production environment. To skip that, we'll be using this flag called as omit dev. Once the packages are installed, then we'll copy the source code from the directory inside the container. And then we'll run a new command, that is add group -g. I'll mention the group ID as 101 with flag yes, and I'll name it as Node.js. Now, what does this line do? This line will create a user group called as Node.js. Now, what is this 1001? What is this -s? Now, 1001 is a group ID. Now, question comes, why I have mentioned as 1001? So this is a specific format that we will be using to create the IDs for groups and users. Now, suppose if the group ID is 0, that means it's the super admin. And now, suppose if the group IDs is associated between 1 to 99, then those groups are your system accounts like daemon, bin, etc. If the group naming is from 100 to 999, then those ID belong to service accounts. And above 1000, those are all your normal users. So since we are assigning Node.js as a normal users, we are using 1001. Now, after this, we'll create a user using run, and I'll be running a command called as add user with flag yes, and I'll name the user as Node.js with a flag called as user, that is -u, with user ID 1001. Now, what is the purpose of creating these user and user groups? So just for the security of our container, meaning suppose if you don't specify the access of the user, it will have direct access to our container, our host machine, and all the processes and the file system. So to avoid that issue, we'll be using these users. And here I have mentioned a flag called as -s. Now, what does this flag mean? This says this username Node.js can log in without an email or password, meaning just by using this username and the access, I can log into my container. That is the meaning of this. Then once I have added the user, I will switch to the user. So I'll run, and here I'll mention it as Node.js. User which we created here will switch to that user. Now, before we switch to that user, we need to give the ownership to that user. For that, we'll be using run chon r node.js/app. Now, what is the meaning of this? chown. This is change ownership with read-only access, that is -r, of user group Node.js with username Node.js can access this /app. So that is the meaning of this command, where we are giving the ownership to the user Node.js into this directory. Apart from this directory, the user Node.js can't access anything. Then once we give the access, we'll switch the user into Node.js, and then we'll expose the port as 3000, and then I'll be using cmd, and here that is npm, and my command is start. Now, before executing the cmd, I'll have a command to check the health of my container. So how can I do it? So I will add a flag called as health check. So it will accept these as parameters, that what is the interval it need to check, what is the timeout, start period, and number of retries. And here it will take a cmd, that is executable command. So here the executable command is, do one thing, I'll put it in a new line, and then here I will use cmd node -e, and I will pass a parameter called as require. In that I'll be using http, and I will call a function that will raise a get request to the URL specified below. So http://localhost 3000/health, and here I'll send the response. So let me embed this with a bracket, and I'll be using arrow function. So here I'll be using process.exit if response.status code is exactly equal to 200, then it is 0, else it is true. Okay, I have a space there. Let me fix that. Yes. Now, what does this command do? When the container starts, it will do a health check. So for health check, it will use this library, that is HTTPS, and it will raise a request to our endpoint /health, which will call a function which accepts a response, and it will try to process this status code. So this is the meaning of this health check. Now we'll come to our server.js and we'll define this health check endpoint. Now I'll be using app.get, I'll put it as health. Okay, I need to close the bracket here, and inside this I'll define the response, that is response.json, and inside that I will send the health check as status, put it as healthy, and then I'll put the timestamp, new date to ISO, then I'll pass the uptime, and I'll pass the process uptime. So what this will return? This will return the status called as healthy, and what is the timestamp this function was called, and what is the uptime of that process. Now I have defined the Dockerfile. Now let me define my Docker ignore and Git ignore, because I want to exclude all the node modules when I push into my Git folder. I'll create a file called as .gitignore, and inside that I'll specify to ignore the node modules, dist, build, logs, So whatever it is suggesting, I just give it a tab. Then I need to ignore the DS store, env local. Yeah. Then similarly, I'll create another called as Docker. Sorry, it's dot Docker ignore. Now inside this, I'll ignore the node modules, the dist file, build files, logs, debug, yarn debug, DS store, envs, and then I'll ignore the readme file, the Docker file, sorry, then dot Docker ignore. So, and also I'll ignore the git ignore file. So I hope I have ignored all this. Yes. Now I have defined my application server using Node and Express. Then I have defined my Docker container, and I have defined my Docker ignore, and also with git ignore. So let us try to spin up our container. So before we spin up our container, let me clear my terminal. I use it in the container. To build the image, I'll be using Podman build, and I'll tag it using -t. I'll give it as Node Express, and I'll specify where my Docker file is available. So it's available in the current directory, so I'll keep it as doc. I'll hit enter. So let's wait until our Docker image is being built. Yes, our Docker image has been built. If you see the logs, here you can see the npm install. Then here you can see the assignment of group and user. Now I'll use clear. Now I'll use this image to run my container. So I'll be using Podman. Then I'll be using run with detached mode with port 3000:3000 and the name of our app, that is Node Express, and I'll hit enter. So this detach command will return the container ID. Till then, I'll open my Podman desktop, and okay, here it's showing we are getting an issue. Why is that? Okay, the issue might be because here in server.js we have not defined a function where we can listen to that port. So we'll be using app.listen port, and we'll be using the arrow function. So instead of this, I'll use this and semicolon. And here, inside the function, I'll log server running on port 3000. So let me rebuild the image. Meanwhile, let me check the Dockerfile. Yes. So if we face the error again, instead of npm start, we can try with the equivalent node server.js. So let's see. Yes, the container has spun up. If I come here, yes, I can say the log saying the server is running on port 3000. So let me open my browser, and here let me search localhost 3000. Here you can see that we got a successful response from our API endpoint. Then we had another called as /users. Here we go. Here we are able to retrieve the data that is present in our JSON. To check the post request, I'll be using my terminal. I'll come to my Visual Studio Code, clear. I'll use this curl command and I'll hit enter. So here we can see a success message. Now if I come back here, if I try to reload, here I can see 3 users. I'll come back to my terminal. I'll paste the command. Here I'll change the email ID to 123. Instead of John Smith, I'll do it as John123 and I'll hit enter. So ID is 4 and yes, things are working perfectly. Now, this is a simple example of Node and Express.js app. But how we can containerize this simple application we have seen in this video. In the upcoming video, we will see how we can containerize a Next.js application. Next.js, our most powerful backend framework of Node.js that is used to build your enterprise backends. So how we can build a small app using Next.js and containerizing it using Podman. So we'll see in the next video. If you felt this video useful, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. Till then, stay tuned for my next video. Thank you.